As the gentle mists of time part, like curtains in an ancient theatre, dear listener, we find ourselves drawn into the shadowed halls of a story that has waited patiently to be told. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let us journey together to a place where magic flows through bloodlines like rivers through ancient stone, where portraits whisper secrets in gilded frames, and where a young boy named Regulus Black first drew breath in a world that would both shape and be shaped by his quiet courage. The year was 1961, and London lay beneath a blanket of December snow when Regulus Arcturus Black entered the world. But this was not the London of Muggle eyes, with its bustling streets and ordinary sorrows. No, this was the London that existed in the spaces between where Diagon Alley hummed with magical commerce, where the night bus careened through invisible pathways, and where certain townhouses held secrets that would make even the bravest souls pause at their thresholds. At number 12, Grimmauld Place, the ancient house of Black stood sentinel in the gathering dusk of that winter evening. To Muggle eyes, the street appeared to skip from 11 to 13, but those with magical sight knew better. There, pressed between its mundane neighbours, like a dark jewel in a crown of ordinary stones, stood one of the most formidable pure-blood residences in all of Wizarding Britain. The house itself seemed to breathe with centuries of accumulated magic. Its blackened brick facade rose 4 stories into the London sky, each window gleaming with an inner light that spoke of enchantments older than memory. Serpentine door knockers coiled upon the heavy front door, their emerald eyes flickering with awareness, while the number 12 gleamed in silver that never seemed to tarnish, no matter how many London fogs rolled past its surface. Inside these hallowed and haunted halls, as the clock in the entrance hall chimed the midnight hour, while Burga Black laboured to bring forth her second son, the delivery took place in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, a room draped in the heavy velvet curtains of deep forest green and silver, where portraits of long-dead Black ancestors watched from their gilded frames, with expressions ranging from curiosity to stern approval. The room itself told the story of the Black family legacy. Ancient tapestries depicted the constellation from which the family took their name, with each star representing a family member, their light, bright, or dim, depending on their standing within the pure-blood community. Magical portraits lined the walls, stern-faced wizards and witches whose eyes seemed to follow every movement, their painted lips occasionally moving in whispered conversations that only they could hear as Regulus drew his first breath in this world of shadows and silver. The very house seemed to sigh with satisfaction. The gas lamps flickered in rhythm with his infant cries, and somewhere in the depths of the house, the family's house elf creature felt a tremor in the magical atmosphere that spoke of destiny and consequence in equal measure. Orion Black, the family patriarch, stood by the tall windows that overlooked the square, his reflection ghostly in the frost-touched glass. He was a man carved from the same noble stone as his ancestors, tall, with the characteristic Black family features of dark hair and aristocratic bearing. His robes, cut from the finest materials and adorned with silver buttons bearing the family crest, spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries of careful breeding and shrewd magical investments. Another son, he murmured to the winter night, his breath fogging the enchanted window pane. Another star to add to our constellation. The family tree tapestry, which hung in the drawing room like a great work of art, would soon be updated with golden thread to include young Regulus's name. This tapestry was no ordinary family record. It was a living, breathing chronicle of the Black bloodline, stretching back through centuries of pure blood heritage. Names appeared and disappeared according to the family's approval, and blast marks scarred the places where the unworthy had been burned away from the family record. In the days following Regulus's birth, visitors came to pay their respects. The cream of pure blood society made their way through the Flue network or apparated directly into the ornate entrance hall, their expensive robes rustling against the polished marble floors. The Malfoys arrived bearing gifts of ancient protective charms worked in silver and obsidian. The Lestrangers brought rare magical texts bound in dragon hide. Each gift was carefully examined, not just for its value, but for its appropriateness to a child destined to carry forward the most ancient and noble traditions. 3-year-old Sirius, already showing signs of the rebellious spirit that would later define him, peered at his new brother with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been relief. No longer would he bear alone the weight of family expectations. Here was another to share the burden of being a Black, another to carry forward the legacy that stretched back through generations of wizards and witches who had helped shape the magical world. The nursery where baby Regulus spent his earliest days was a marvel of protective enchantments and family tradition. The walls were painted with moving murals depicting the night sky, with constellations slowly wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. The Black family constellation held pride of place above the enchanted crib, its stars twinkling with actual light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the infant's heartbeat. Magical mobiles hung suspended in the air above his crib, not held by any visible strings, but floating through the power of ancient levitation charms. Tiny silver snakes ride through miniature castles, while ravens with emerald eyes perched on branches that bloomed with flowers that changed color with the seasons. These were not mere toys, but family heirlooms, passed down from generation to generation, each one carrying protective enchantments woven by Black family members stretching back through the centuries. The house itself seemed to welcome its newest inhabitant. Portraits that had remained silent for decades began to whisper among themselves, their painted eyes following the baby's movements with interest that bordered on hunger. The very walls hummed with expectation, as if the building itself understood that within this child lay the potential to either elevate or destroy everything the Black family had built over their long and storied history. Creature, the family's ancient house elf, tended to young Master Regulus with a devotion that went beyond mere duty. The elf had served the Black family for decades, his loyalty as unshakable as the foundations of Grimmauld Place itself. He would often be found in the nursery during the quiet hours of night, his large lamp-like eyes watching over the sleeping child while his gnarled fingers worked to maintain the protective charms that surrounded the crib. Master Regulus, Creature would whisper in his creaky voice, blood of the noble house of Black, heir to ancient magic and older promises. The house elf understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight that rested upon those tiny shoulders, the legacy that would shape every choice the boy would make as he grew. As the seasons turned and baby Regulus grew From infant to toddler, the house continued to work its subtle magic upon him. The portraits began to speak to him in gentle voices, telling him stories of family glory and pure blood superiority. Great-great-grandmother Elidora Black, whose portrait hung in the formal drawing room, would regale him with tales of her successful campaign to make Muggle hunting legal. His ancestor, Cygnus Black I, would speak of the family's role in supporting the pureblood cause through the centuries. The library, vast and filled with tomes of dark knowledge, became young Regulus's favorite retreat as he learned to walk and then to run through the corridors of his ancestral home. Leather-bound volumes reached from floor to ceiling, their spines gleaming with titles in languages both ancient and modern. Some books were chained to their shelves, too dangerous to be handled by untrained hands, while others glowed with a soft inner light that spoke of powerful enchantments worked into their very pages. Here, among the accumulated wisdom and whispered secrets of generations, Regulus would eventually learn about his family's true nature. The Black family library contained one of the most comprehensive collections of dark arts texts in all of Britain, carefully assembled over centuries by family members who understood that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, was power. But for now, as a child barely old enough to form words, Regulus simply absorbed the atmosphere of ancient magic that permeated every corner of his world. The house sang to him with voices only he could hear, lullabies composed of spells and incantations that had been woven into the very foundations of Grimmauld Place. His dreams were filled with silver serpents and emerald stars, with portraits that stepped out of their frames to dance with him through corridors that stretched into infinity. The drawing room, where the family gathered for formal occasions, told the story of Black family pride in every carefully chosen detail. The walls were covered in rich, dark paneling that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Heavy curtains of deep green velvet blocked out the mundane world beyond the windows, while crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows that moved according to no earthly wind. The furniture spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries, chairs upholstered in leather so fine it felt like silk, tables carved from wood taken from trees that had grown in magical groves, carpets woven with threads that contained actual silver and gold. Every piece had been chosen not just for its beauty, but for its ability to project the power and authority of the Black family name. As young Regulus grew, he began to understand that he was not merely a child, but a repository of hopes and expectations that stretched back through generations. The family motto, toujours pur, always pure, was not simply words carved into stone above doorways and embroidered on tapestries. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility that had been passed down from parent to child like a precious and dangerous inheritance. The house began to test him as it had tested every Black child before him. Doors would open at his approach, recognizing his bloodline and welcoming him into rooms that remained locked to outsiders. Portraits would turn to follow his movements, their painted eyes assessing, judging, weighing his worthiness to carry forward the family name. The very air seemed to thicken around him sometimes, heavy with the expectations of ancestors who watched from beyond the veil of death. In the depths of winter, when snow piled high against the windows and the fire in the great hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, the house would tell him stories through its magical emanations. He would dream of knights in silver armor who rode beneath banners bearing the Black family crest, of witches and wizards who had shaped the course of magical history through their understanding that blood purity was not merely a belief, but a sacred duty. And so, dear listener, as we watch young Regulus Black take his first steps through the corridors of power and ancient magic, let us remember that every story of courage begins with a single breath. Every tale of sacrifice starts with a moment of innocence. The House of Black had claimed another son, had wrapped him in his traditions and expectations like swaddling clothes made of silver and shadow. The boy who would one day sacrifice everything to oppose the darkness was still years away from understanding the true cost of the legacy he had inherited. For now, he was simply a child of noble blood and ancient magic, growing up in a house where the very walls whispered of destiny and consequence, where every portrait held secrets that would shape the course of his life in ways he could never imagine. Rest now, dear listener, as young Regulus rests in his enchanted crib, surrounded by protective charms and ancestral love. Let the gentle magic of this ancient house lull you toward peaceful sleep, knowing that sometimes the greatest heroes are born not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet spaces between breaths, in the sacred silence where destiny begins to weave its intricate patterns. The years pass like gentle waves upon a distant shore. Dear listener, each season bringing new wonders and whispered secrets to the ancient halls of Grimmauld Place. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your evening rest, let us drift forward through time to watch young Regulus Black grow from infant to child, his world expanding like ripples in a moonlit pond, each new discovery both magical and profound. By the time Regulus had reached his 4th birthday, the House of Black had begun to reveal more of its mysteries to him. Where once he had been confined to the nursery and a few safe corridors, now the ancient building opened its doors like petals of a dark flower, welcoming him into chambers that held centuries of accumulated magic and memory. The morning light that filtered through the tall windows of Grimmauld Place seemed different from ordinary sunlight. It carried with it the weight of enchantments, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and illuminating dust motes that sparkled like tiny stars suspended in amber. Regulus would often stand at these windows, his small hands pressed against the cool glass, watching the Muggle world beyond with the detached curiosity of one who knew he belonged to something far grander and more mysterious. His brother Sirius, now 7 years old, and already showing signs of the magnetic charisma that would define him throughout his life, had become both guide and rival in young Regulus's expanding universe. Where Sirius was fire, bright, unpredictable, and quick to consume whatever caught his attention, Regulus was more like water, quiet and reflective, absorbing everything around him with a depth that sometimes surprised even their parents. "Come along, Reg," Sirius would say, using the pet name that only he was allowed to speak. "Let me show you something brilliant." And off they would go, 2 small figures racing through corridors lined with portraits that turned their painted heads to watch their passage, their footsteps echoing off marble floors that had been walked upon by generations of black children before them. It was during one such adventure that Regulus experienced his first truly memorable display of accidental magic. The brothers had been exploring the library, that vast cathedral of forbidden knowledge where dust motes danced in shafts of filtered sunlight, and the very air seemed thick with accumulated wisdom. Sirius had been reaching for a book on a high shelf, a tome bound in midnight blue leather with silver clasps that gleamed like captured starlight. "Mother says we mustn't touch the books without permission," Regulus had whispered, his voice barely audible in the library's reverent silence. "Mother says a lot of things," Sirius replied with the casual dismissiveness that was becoming his trademark. "Besides, how are we supposed to learn if we don't explore?" But as Sirius stretched toward the forbidden volume, the ladder beneath him began to wobble. Regulus watched in growing alarm as his brother swayed precariously, reaching desperately for the book, while the ancient wooden ladder creaked ominously beneath his weight. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching like honey poured from a great height. And in that suspended moment, something awakened within young Regulus. Without conscious thought, without wand or incantation, Regulus reached out with his small hand as if he could somehow grasp his brother across the space that separated them. What happened next would be remembered for years to come in the whispered conversations of family portraits and the knowing glances of ancient house elves. The ladder steadied, as if gripped by invisible hands. The book that Sirius had been reaching for floated gently down from its shelf, drifting through the air like a feather on a summer breeze. Most remarkably of all, every candle in the library, dozens of them perched on reading tables and in wall sconces, flared to life simultaneously, bathing the entire room in warm golden light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Regulus's rapid heartbeat. Sirius descended the ladder with careful dignity, the floating book settling into his hands as gently as a bird alighting on a familiar perch. For a long moment, the brothers stared at each other across the illuminated space, both understanding that something profound had just occurred. "Well done, little brother," Sirius said, finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "That was brilliant magic." Regulus felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the magical flames dancing around them. To earn Sirius's approval was rare and precious, more valuable than all the ancient treasures that filled their family home. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle light of his own unconscious magic, Regulus began to understand that he possessed something special, something that connected him to the long line of powerful wizards and witches whose portraits watched from the library walls. Word of the incident spread through the house with the speed of whispered spells. Creature, who seemed to materialize wherever interesting events occurred, had witnessed the entire display from his position among the book stacks. His ancient eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he related the tale to the kitchen's magical implements, which clattered and chimed their approval. "Young Master Regulus shows the Black family power," Creature croaked to anyone who would listen. "Strong magic flows in his veins. Yes, it does. The ancient bloodline remains pure and potent." While Burger Black received the news with the sort of fierce maternal pride that was characteristic of pure-blood families, her younger son's magical display was not merely a childhood accident, but a confirmation of everything she had believed about the superiority of their bloodline. That evening, as twilight painted the windows of Grimmauld Place in shades of deep purple and silver, she summoned both boys to the formal drawing room. The room itself seemed to anticipate the importance of the moment. The portraits of ancient black ancestors leaned forward in their frames, their painted eyes bright with interest. The fire in the great hearth burned with flames of emerald and silver, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move in time with some unheard music. Heavy curtains of midnight velvet blocked out the Muggle world beyond, creating a space that existed purely within the realm of magical possibility. Regulus, Walburga said, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of pure blood tradition. You have shown today that the magic of our family flows strong within you. This is not merely power, child. It is responsibility. The magic that answered your call today is the same force that has elevated the Black family above the common rabble for 1,000 years. She gestured toward the family tapestry that dominated one wall of the room, its golden threads catching the magical firelight and seeming to pulse with life of their own. Each star upon this tapestry represents not just a person, but a guardian of our ancient ways. Your magic today proved that you are worthy to take your place among them. Regulus listened with the solemn attention that such pronouncements deserved, his young mind struggling to comprehend the full weight of his mother's words. He understood that what had happened in the library was important, but the true significance, the way it marked him as inheritor of both power and peril, would only become clear with time. Sirius, standing beside his younger brother, felt a different kind of stirring in response to their mother's words. Where Regulus heard destiny calling, Sirius heard the rattle of chains. The same magical heritage that seemed to promise young Regulus a glorious future felt to Sirius like a cage being constructed around his own dreams and aspirations. As the months passed, Regulus's magical abilities continued to manifest in small but significant ways. Books would fall open to exactly the passages he needed to read. Quills would write with perfect penmanship, even when his small hands trembled with effort. Most remarkably, the portraits throughout the house began to respond to him with increasing warmth and recognition. Great-great-grandmother Elidora Black, whose stern portrait had intimidated generations of black children, began to smile when young Regulus approached her frame. She would tell him stories of the family's glorious past, of wizards and witches who had shaped the magical world through their unwavering commitment to pure blood principles. You have the look of your ancestor Arcturus, she would say, her painted eyes twinkling with approval. He too possessed magic that answered to his will without need for wands or incantations. Such power comes only to those whose blood runs pure and true. The family's ancient grimoires, normally sealed with protective charms that prevented unauthorized access, began to crack open at Regulus's touch. Not enough to reveal their darkest secrets. He was still far too young for such knowledge, but sufficient to hint at the vast repositories of magical learning that would one day be his to command. Creature, meanwhile, had become the boy's devoted shadow. The ancient house elf seemed to recognize in young Regulus a kindred spirit, someone who understood the value of tradition and the importance of maintaining the old ways. He would often be found in the boy's company during the quiet hours of afternoon, sharing stories of the family's history that were not recorded in any book or captured in any portrait. The Black family has always stood for what is right and proper, Creature would whisper as they sat together in the kitchen, surrounded by magical implements that gleamed in the light of the ever-burning hearth. Pure blood is not just breeding, young master. It is a sacred trust, a responsibility to preserve the magic that lesser beings would dilute and destroy. These conversations planted seeds in Regulus's young mind that would grow and flourish in the years to come. Unlike Sirius, who increasingly questioned the values their family held dear, Regulus found comfort and purpose in the idea that he was part of something greater than himself, heir to a legacy that stretched back through centuries of magical achievement. The differences between the two brothers became more pronounced as they grew. Where Sirius delighted in challenging authority and questioning established traditions, Regulus sought to understand and embrace them. Where Sirius saw restrictions and limitations, Regulus saw order and purpose. Where Sirius dreamed of escape and adventure beyond the walls of Grimmauld Place, Regulus found endless fascination in the mysteries contained within. During the long winter evenings, when snow piled high against the enchanted windows and the magical fires burned bright in every hearth, the family would gather in the drawing room for what Walburga called education in proper values. These sessions were part history lesson, part philosophical discussion, and part sacred ritual, designed to ensure that each new generation of Blacks understood their place in the greater tapestry of magical society. Regulus absorbed these lessons with the quiet intensity that was becoming his trademark. He learned about the importance of blood purity, about the sacred responsibility of magical families to preserve their heritage against the encroachment of Muggle influence. He discovered that their family had played crucial roles in every major conflict in wizarding history, always standing on the side of tradition and proper order. The magical world has always been threatened by those who would diminish it. Orion Black would intone from his position before the great fireplace, his shadow stretching across the room like a dark prophecy. Half-bloods who lack true understanding, Muggle-borns who bring their inferior ways into our sacred spaces, blood traitors who abandon their heritage for temporary popularity. It falls to families like ours to ensure that true magic survives. These words resonated deeply with young Regulus, creating within him a sense of purpose that would guide many of his future choices. Unlike Sirius, who rolled his eyes and shifted restlessly during these sessions, Regulus leaned forward with rapt attention, his young mind drinking in every word like a desert absorbing precious rain. As his 6th birthday approached, Regulus had grown into a thoughtful, observant child, whose quiet intensity often surprised adults. He possessed his family's characteristic dark hair and aristocratic features, but where Sirius's eyes blazed with rebellion and mischief, Regulus's held depths that seemed far older than his years. The magical accidents that had begun in the library continued to manifest in increasingly sophisticated ways. Protective charms would activate around him during moments of stress or fear. Plants in the conservatory bloomed out of season when he walked among them. Most remarkably, the house itself seemed to respond to his presence, doors opening at his approach and passages revealing themselves that had remained hidden for generations. The autumn of 1972 arrived at Grimmauld Place with a whisper of change that seemed to dance through every corridor and settle into every shadowed corner. Dear listener, as you allow yourself to drift deeper into the peaceful embrace of evening, let us journey with 11-year-old Regulus Black as he stands on the threshold between childhood and destiny. his Hogwarts letter clutched in hands that trembled with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. The morning of September first dawned crisp and golden over London, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed crafted by magic itself. In the master bedroom of Grimmauld Place, Regulus Black stood before her younger son, her hands smoothing the fabric of his new school robes with the careful attention of a mother who understood that she was dressing her child not merely for school, but for the beginning of his true inheritance. "Remember, Regulus," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of Black family tradition. "You carry with you today the honor of our ancient name. Every choice you make, every friendship you form, every lesson you learn, all of it reflects upon the family that has shaped you." Regulus nodded solemnly, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. The boy who stood before the mirror bore little resemblance to the carefree child who had once run laughing through these same corridors. Time and teaching had molded him into something more refined, more purposeful, a young wizard who understood the weight of his heritage and wore it with quiet dignity. His school trunk, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship wrought from ancient oak and bound with silver fittings, sat open beside his bed. Within its depths lay everything a young Black heir would need for his first year at Hogwarts: robes of the finest quality, books whose leather bindings gleamed with protective enchantments, quills carved from phoenix feathers, and parchment that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. But it was not the expensive accoutrements that made this moment significant. It was the invisible weight of expectation that settled around Regulus's shoulders like an ancestral cloak. Every Black who had attended Hogwarts had been sorted into Slytherin House, and the family portraits had made it clear that any deviation from this tradition would be considered nothing short of catastrophe. The journey to King's Cross Station passed in a blur of Muggle London streets and whispered family advice. Creature had tearfully pressed a small package of his finest treacle tart into Regulus's hands, his ancient eyes gleaming with pride and worry in equal measure. The house elf had served 3 generations of Black children, and each departure for Hogwarts felt to him like watching a star leave its constellation to find its place in a larger universe. "Master Regulus will make the family proud," Creature had croaked, his gnarled fingers adjusting the boy's collar one final time. The ancient house of Black has produced great wizards for centuries, and young Master will continue that noble tradition. Platform 9 3/4 revealed itself with the familiar magic that never failed to quicken Regulus's pulse. The Hogwarts Express stood gleaming in the magical sunlight, its scarlet engine breathing steam like a great dragon preparing for flight. Students and families crowded the platform, creating a symphony of excited voices, hooting owls, and the occasional muffled explosion from someone's experimental magical devices. Regulus found himself comparing this moment to the stories Sirius had told him about his own departure for Hogwarts 2 years earlier. But where Sirius had approached his Hogwarts journey with barely contained rebellion and secret dreams of disappointing the family, Regulus felt only a deep sense of purpose and belonging. This was his inheritance, his birthright, the next step in a journey that had begun with his first breath in the ancient halls of Grimmauld Place. The train journey to Hogwarts passed like a dream wrapped in autumn mist. Regulus found himself sharing a compartment with other pure-blood children, whose names he recognized from family gatherings and society functions. There was Bartemius Crouch Jr., whose father held a prominent position in the Ministry of Magic, and whose sharp intelligence gleamed behind eyes that seemed to calculate the potential value of every conversation. Evan Rosier sat beside the window, his aristocratic features reflecting the kind of casual arrogance that came with centuries of magical breeding. These were the sons of families who moved in the same circles as the Blacks. Young wizards who had been raised with the same values and expectations that had shaped Regulus's own childhood. Their conversation flowed easily over topics of family honor, blood purity, and the sacred traditions that separated true wizards from the common masses who had begun to dilute the magical world. My father says that Dumbledore allows far too many Muggle-borns into the school these days. Evan Rosier commented, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness that characterized pure-blood attitudes toward those they considered inferior. It's corrupting the very foundations of magical education. Regulus found himself nodding in agreement, the lessons learned in his family's drawing room rising naturally to the surface. These were not new ideas to him. They were as familiar and comfortable as the ancient tapestries that hung in Grimmauld Place, woven so deeply into his understanding of the world that he had never thought to question them. As the Hogwarts Express wound its way through the Scottish countryside, Regulus pressed his face to the window and watched the landscape transform from mundane English fields to something that seemed touched by ancient magic. Mountains rose like sleeping giants against the darkening sky, their peaks shrouded in mist that seemed to move with purpose and intention. Lakes gleamed like scattered jewels in the gathering dusk, their surfaces reflecting stars that appeared far brighter than any he had seen in London's sky. The first glimpse of Hogwarts Castle struck Regulus with the force of recognition rather than surprise. It was exactly as his family portraits had described it, a magnificent fortress of learning perched upon its rocky outcrop, windows glowing like golden eyes in the darkness. Towers reached toward the star-filled sky like fingers grasping for celestial wisdom, while the great hall's illuminated windows promised warmth and wonder in equal measure. The boat journey across the lake felt like crossing a threshold between worlds. Hagrid's massive silhouette guided the first years across waters that reflected the castle's lights like scattered diamonds, while something ancient and powerful seemed to stir in the depths below. Regulus could feel magic rising from the lake itself, seeping up through the water and into his bones, welcoming him to a place where his heritage would finally find its full expression. The great hall took his breath away with its sheer magnificence. The enchanted ceiling showed the night sky in all its glory, stars wheeling overhead in patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning. 4 long tables stretched the length of the hall, each representing one of Hogwarts' ancient houses, while at the high table, the professors sat in their formal robes like guardians of accumulated wisdom. But it was the sorting hat that commanded Regulus's attention most completely. The ancient patched wizard's hat sat upon its 3-legged stool like a relic from the founding days of the school, its magical consciousness older than any living wizard. As Professor McGonagall called the first years forward, one by one, Regulus felt his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that surprised him. When his name was finally called, Black, Regulus, The great hall seemed to fall into a hushed expectancy. Every eye followed his progress to the stool, and he could feel the weight of family history pressing down upon him like a physical force. At the Slytherin table, older students leaned forward with interest, recognizing the family name and expecting the continuation of a tradition that stretched back through generations. The sorting hat settled over his head like a familiar embrace, and immediately Regulus felt the alien presence of another consciousness touching his own. It was not an unpleasant sensation, more like having a wise ancient grandfather suddenly appear in his thoughts, ready to offer counsel based on centuries of accumulated experience. Another Black, the hat's voice, whispered inside his mind, carrying notes of amusement and satisfaction. Yes, I remember your brother well. Interesting boy, young Sirius, full of fire and rebellion, determined to forge his own path regardless of family expectations. But you're different, aren't you? Regulus felt the hat probing gently at his thoughts and memories, examining the careful education he had received in the drawing rooms of Grimmauld Place, the pride he felt in his family's ancient heritage, the sense of purpose that had been cultivated within him from his earliest childhood. Ambitious, yes, the hat continued thoughtfully, but not in the crude way of those who seek power for its own sake. You have a deeper understanding of what power means: responsibility, tradition, the sacred trust of carrying forward something greater than yourself, and courage too, though not the flashy, reckless courage of your brother. Yours is the quiet courage of conviction, the strength to stand for what you believe, even when the cost is high. The seconds stretched like hours as the hat deliberated, weighing aspects of Regulus's character that even he was not fully aware of possessing. He could feel the ancient magic examining not just his present self, but the potential futures that lay before him, the choices that would define the man he would become. You could do well in Ravenclaw, the hat mused. That mind of yours is sharp enough for scholarly pursuits, and there's enough loyalty in you for Hufflepuff, though perhaps not the right kind. But no, your path lies elsewhere, doesn't it? Where you belong, where your family has always belonged, where you can best serve the greater purpose that calls to you. Slytherin. The word rang out across the great hall like a bell tolling destiny, and the Slytherin table erupted in enthusiastic applause. Regulus felt a surge of relief and pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed him as he made his way to join his new housemates, accepting congratulations and welcoming gestures with the quiet dignity that had been bred into him from birth. The Slytherin common room revealed itself as a place of dark magnificence that spoke to every aspect of Regulus's aesthetic sensibilities. Located beneath the Great Lake, the room was lit by green-tinged light that filtered through the water above, creating an atmosphere of mysterious beauty that seemed perfectly suited to the house's ancient traditions. Tapestries bearing the Slytherin serpent adorned the walls, while comfortable leather chairs and dark wood furniture created intimate spaces for study and conversation. It was here, in the depths of the castle where ambition and cunning were valued above all else, that Regulus began to truly understand his place in the larger tapestry of the wizarding world. His doormates, Barty Crouch Jr., Evan Rosier, and a quiet boy named Mulciber, whose family owned vast estates in the Scottish Highlands, quickly became his closest companions, united by similar backgrounds and shared values. The older Slytherin students welcomed Regulus with a kind of recognition reserved for those whose family names carried weight in pure blood circles. Lucius Malfoy, a six-year prefect whose platinum hair and aristocratic bearing commanded respect throughout the house, took particular interest in the youngest Black. "Your family has always been a pillar of proper wizarding society," Lucius said during one of their evening conversations in the common room, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose own family had wielded influence for generations. "These are important times, Regulus. The magical world stands at a crossroads, and it will be up to young wizards like yourself to ensure that tradition and proper order prevail over the chaos that threatens to engulf us." Such conversations became a regular feature of Regulus's evenings in the Slytherin common room. The older students spoke in hushed tones about a great wizard who was working to restore the natural order of things, someone who understood that the magical world had been corrupted by years of liberal policies and dangerous egalitarian ideals. They spoke of a future where pure-blood wizards would once again take their rightful place as leaders of magical society, where ancient traditions would be honored rather than abandoned. Regulus absorbed these discussions with the same quiet intensity he had brought to his family's educational sessions at Grimmauld Place. Here was validation of everything he had been taught, confirmation that his family's values were not merely old-fashioned prejudices, but necessary truths that would guide the wizarding world back to greatness. His academic performance at Hogwarts proved exceptional from the very beginning. In defense against the dark arts, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of protective magic that impressed even the notoriously difficult Professor Mulciber. His essays in the history of magic revealed a deep appreciation for the traditional structures that had governed magical society for centuries. In potions, taught by Professor Slughorn in the dungeon laboratories, that had become as familiar to him as his own bedroom, Regulus showed the kind of precise, methodical approach that produced consistently outstanding results. But it was in his relationships with his professors and fellow students that Regulus truly began to distinguish himself, where Sirius had been notorious for his casual disregard for authority and his tendency to question established principles. Regulus approached his education with respectful attention and genuine eagerness to learn. This attitude earned him the approval of professors who had grown weary of dealing with rebellious students who seemed more interested in challenging tradition than in mastering the ancient arts. Professor Slughorn, in particular, seemed delighted to have another Black in his advanced potions classes, though he occasionally made wistful comments about the different path Sirius had chosen. During their private tutorials held in the professor's comfortable office overlooking the lake, Slughorn would speak admiringly of the Black family's contributions to magical society and express his hope that Regulus would continue that proud tradition. Time flows like a river in the depths of night, dear listener, carrying us forward through seasons of change and moments of profound consequence. As you allow your breathing to deepen and your body to settle into perfect stillness, let us drift alongside young Regulus Black as he moves through his later years at Hogwarts, when childhood certainties begin to give way to the complex realities of a world balanced on the knife's edge between light and shadow. The autumn of Regulus's 6th year at Hogwarts arrived with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate every stone of the ancient castle. The wizarding world beyond the protective walls of the school was changing, though the nature of that change was whispered about in hushed conversations, rather than discussed openly in the light of day. In the Slytherin common room, beneath the gentle green glow of the Great Lake, these whispers took on the weight of prophecy and promise. Regulus, now 17, and bearing the lean, aristocratic features that marked him unmistakably as a Black, had grown into a young wizard of considerable presence and quiet authority. His dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that seemed to capture and hold shadows, while his eyes, those same deep, thoughtful eyes that had watched the world with such intensity since childhood, now carried depths that spoke of secrets shared and loyalties tested. The Slytherin dormitory had become his sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the increasing complexity of castle life to contemplate the choices that lay before him. His four-poster bed, hung with silver-green curtains that blocked out both light and sound, often felt like a cocoon from which he could observe the transformation occurring not just in the world around him, but within himself. It was during one of these quiet evening reflections that Evan Roger approached him with news that would fundamentally alter the course of his young life. Rosier, now a 7th year and one of the most influential students in Slytherin House, had always moved in circles that extended far beyond the castle walls. His family's connections to the most powerful pure-blood families in Britain meant that he was often privy to developments in the wider wizarding world long before they became common knowledge. "There's someone who wants to meet you," Rosier said, settling into the chair beside Regulus's bed with the casual confidence that had made him a natural leader among their year. "Someone who's been watching your progress with considerable interest." The conversation that followed would echo in Regulus's memory for the rest of his life. Rosier spoke of a great wizard who was working to restore the natural order of magical society, someone who understood that the wizarding world had been weakened by years of misguided policies that elevated the unworthy and diminished the noble. This wizard, whose very name carried power and commanded respect among those who understood the true nature of magical hierarchy, had been gathering around him the finest young wizards from the most ancient families. "He calls himself Lord Voldemort," Rosier continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry more weight than a shout. "He sees the potential in young wizards like us, Regulus. He understands that the future of our world depends on those who have the wisdom to preserve what is truly valuable and the courage to fight against the forces that would destroy it." The name resonated in the depths of Regulus's consciousness, like a bell tolling in a cathedral of shadows. He had heard whispers of this Lord Voldemort in the common room conversations, spoken of with a mixture of admiration and awe that suggested someone whose power transcended ordinary understanding. The older Slytherin students who had already left school would occasionally return for discreet visits, and their conversations would inevitably turn to this mysterious figure who was gathering the most promising young wizards under his banner. That winter, as snow piled deep against the castle windows and the fires in every hearth burned with magical flames that never seemed to consume their fuel, Regulus found himself drawn deeper into a world of whispered meetings and carefully coded conversations. Barty Crouch Jr., whose brilliant mind had always been accompanied by a hunger for recognition and power, had already committed himself to Lord Voldemort's cause. Mulciber and Avery, two seventh years whose families had been loyal to the pure-blood cause for generations, spoke with growing excitement about the privilege of serving such a powerful master. The letters from home during this period carried subtle encouragements that revealed his family's awareness of his growing involvement, while Burger Black's correspondence, always formal and proper, contained references to important decisions and family honor that suggested she understood the path her younger son was contemplating. Orion's letters, fewer but more direct, spoke approvingly of young wizards who had the wisdom to align themselves with those who truly understood the natural order of things. Most significantly, Creature's occasional messages, dictated to his mother since the house elf could not write, carried news from Grimmauld Place that hinted at preparations being made to welcome important guests. The ancient house, with its protective enchantments and long history of harboring pure-blood secrets, was apparently becoming a meeting place for those who shared Lord Voldemort's vision of magical society's proper structure. It was in the spring of his 6th year that Regulus received the invitation that would seal his fate. The parchment arrived with no owl, no visible means of delivery. It simply appeared on his bedside table one morning, sealed with black wax that bore the impression of a serpent coiled around a skull. The message within was brief, but unmistakably significant. Your presence is requested at a gathering of those who would serve the greater good of wizarding society. Come to the place where your family's honor dwells, when the moon rises full above London's ancient stones. Come prepared to commit yourself to a cause greater than any individual ambition. The night of the full moon found Regulus standing in the familiar drawing room of Grimmauld Place, but the space had been transformed into something that seemed to pulse with dark magnificence. The portraits of his ancestors had been covered with black cloth, creating an atmosphere of solemn ceremony that made even the most mundane objects seem charged with significance. Candles floated in precise formations overhead, their flames burning with colors that shifted between deep purple and silver green, casting shadows that moved independently of any earthly source. Perhaps a dozen figures stood in a circle around the room's perimeter, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. At the circle's center stood a figure whose presence commanded attention through sheer force of will rather than any physical characteristic. Tall and elegant, with features that spoke of aristocratic breeding refined to an almost ethereal perfection, Lord Voldemort possessed the kind of magnetic authority that made even powerful wizards feel like children in the presence of a master. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it, a sound that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Young Black," he said, and somehow those two simple words seemed to contain volumes of meaning, as if he were addressing not just Regulus, but the entire legacy of the ancient family name. "I have heard much about your potential, your understanding of what it means to be born to greatness. Tonight, you have the opportunity to transform that potential into purpose." The ceremony that followed would remain seared in Regulus's memory, with the clarity of lightning frozen in crystal. Lord Voldemort spoke of the corruption that had infected magical society, of the need for those with true understanding to take their rightful place as leaders and guardians of ancient wisdom. He painted a vision of a future where pure-blood wizards would no longer hide their superiority behind false modesty, where the natural hierarchy that had governed magical society for millennia would be restored and strengthened. As the Dark Lord spoke, Regulus felt something awakening within him that went beyond mere agreement or intellectual assent. This was recognition on a level so fundamental it seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. Here was validation of everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, everything that had shaped his understanding of his place in the world. More than that, here was purpose, a way to transform the abstract principles he had absorbed in childhood into concrete action that could reshape the wizarding world itself. The moment when Lord Voldemort extended his pale, long-fingered hand toward Regulus seemed to last forever and no time at all. The dark mark that would brand him as one of the chosen few was not merely a magical tattoo, but a physical manifestation of commitment that went deeper than words or oaths. As the serpent and skull burned themselves into the pale skin of his left forearm, Regulus felt a connection being forged that transcended the ordinary bonds between wizard and master. The pain was exquisite, not merely physical discomfort, but a sensation that seemed to remake him on a cellular level, burning away the last vestiges of childhood uncertainty and replacing them with the cold clarity of absolute commitment. When it was finished, when the dark mark had settled into his flesh like a brand of honor rather than shame, Regulus looked up to meet Lord Voldemort's red eyes with something approaching rapture. "You are no longer merely Regulus Black," the Dark Lord said, his voice carrying notes of approval that sent warmth flooding through the young wizard's entire being. "You are now Death Eater, servant of a cause that transcends individual desire, guardian of truths that lesser beings cannot comprehend. Your family's honor is now wedded to mine, your destiny intertwined with the greater destiny of our movement." The months that followed were a whirlwind of secret meetings, covert missions, and the intoxicating sense of belonging to something that operated beyond the petty restrictions of conventional magical society. Regulus's final year at Hogwarts became a carefully orchestrated performance, maintaining the facade of a diligent student while actually serving as Lord Voldemort's agent within the castle walls. His academic performance, already exceptional, reached new heights as he channeled his newfound purpose into every aspect of his studies. Defense against the dark arts took on new meaning when he understood that he was preparing himself to defend principles that most wizards lacked the courage to embrace. Potions became an avenue for mastering skills that could serve Lord Voldemort's cause in ways that his professors could never imagine. Even transfiguration, the most theoretical of magical arts, revealed practical applications for someone whose loyalty had been pledged to a master who thought far beyond conventional limitations. Professor Slughorn, ever eager to cultivate promising students, began extending even more personal attention to Regulus during this period. The old professor's collection of influential former students, his Slug Club, had always included members of the most prominent pure-blood families, and Regulus's combination of academic excellence and family connections made him a particularly prized addition to these exclusive gatherings. It was during one of these intimate dinners in Slughorn's private chambers that Regulus first heard mention of Horcruxes, though at the time the reference seemed like nothing more than academic curiosity. Slughorn, his round face flushed with the wine that always flowed freely at these gatherings, had been discussing the theoretical limits of magical achievement when Tom Riddle's name entered the conversation. Brilliant student, Tom Riddle, Slughorn mused, his eyes taking on the distant look that always accompanied his reminiscences about former pupils. Absolutely brilliant. Asked the most interesting questions about the boundaries of magical possibility. Some of his inquiries were quite advanced for someone his age. The conversation moved on to other topics: the influence of pure-blood families on ministry policy, the importance of maintaining traditional values in an increasingly chaotic world. But something about Slughorn's tone when he spoke of Tom Riddle lingered in Regulus's memory like an echo in an empty cathedral. The summer following his graduation from Hogwarts found Regulus fully initiated into the inner circles of Lord Voldemort's organization. No longer constrained by the need to maintain his student facade, he could devote himself entirely to serving the cause that had given his life such profound meaning. Grimmauld Place became a frequent meeting location for Death Eater gatherings, its ancient protective enchantments providing ideal security for discussions that required absolute discretion. Creature, the family's devoted house elf, adapted to these new circumstances with the same unwavering loyalty he had always shown to the Black family interests. If the elderly elf found anything disturbing about the hooded figures who now regularly gathered in his beloved mistress's drawing room, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he seemed to take pride in serving refreshments and maintaining the house's security for these important meetings. The missions that Lord Voldemort assigned to his younger Death Eaters during this period were carefully designed to test their commitment while building their skills in the arts of persuasion and enforcement. Regulus found himself visiting pure-blood families who had shown reluctance to support the Dark Lord's cause, carrying messages that were phrased as invitations but carried the unmistakable weight of ultimatums. These encounters revealed to Regulus the true scope of Lord Voldemort's vision and the resistance it faced even among those who should have been natural allies. Many pure-blood families, comfortable in their traditional positions of privilege, seemed unwilling to risk the disruption that would inevitably accompany the restoration of proper magical hierarchy. They preferred the familiar corruption of the current system to the uncertain challenges of revolutionary change. It was during one such mission, to a manor house in the Scottish Highlands, where an ancient pure-blood family had been wavering in their support, that Regulus first witnessed the full extent of Lord Voldemort's power and the consequences of defying his will. The family's patriarch, a wizard whose bloodline traced back to the medieval founding of the wizarding community, had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor and had begun making overtures to officials in the ministry who opposed the Dark Lord's movement. The demonstration that followed was both educational and terrifying in its implications. Lord Voldemort's magic operated on a level that transcended anything Regulus had witnessed in 7 years of studying at Hogwarts, bending reality itself to serve his will with an ease that suggested power beyond ordinary comprehension. When it was over, when the patriarch's resistance had been definitively overcome, and his family's loyalty secured through means that left no room for future wavering. Regulus understood that he had committed himself to serving not merely a powerful wizard, but a force of nature that would reshape the magical world according to its own inexorable logic. Yet even as he embraced his role as Death Eater with growing confidence and skill, small seeds of unease began to take root in the depths of Regulus's consciousness. They were tiny at first, moments of doubt that flickered like candle flames in a vast darkness, questions that arose unbidden during quiet hours when Lord Voldemort's overwhelming presence was not there to silence them. The treatment of house elves during some missions troubled him more than he cared to admit, especially given his long relationship with Creature. The casual dismissal of magical creatures who had served pure-blood families faithfully for generations seemed to contradict some of the traditional values that had originally drawn him to Lord Voldemort's cause. When he mentioned these concerns to Evan Rosier during one of their private conversations, his old-school friend had laughed them off as sentimental weakness that would fade with experience. More disturbing still were the rumors that began to circulate among the Death Eater ranks about Lord Voldemort's experiments with magic that went far beyond anything taught in conventional wizarding education. Whispers of immortality, of power that transcended the natural limits of magical ability, of research that delved into areas of knowledge that even the most advanced pure-blood families had traditionally considered too dangerous to explore. In the depths of night, when shadows hold their deepest secrets and truth emerges from the darkness like dawn breaking over troubled waters, we find ourselves at the moment when everything changes. Dear listener, as you allow your body to sink deeper into the embrace of peaceful rest, let us journey with Regulus Black through the months that would transform him from devoted follower to silent rebel, when loyalty and horror would wage war within his soul, and when the boy who had sought to serve darkness would find the courage to stand against it. The autumn of 1978 arrived at Grimmauld Place with an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to permeate every enchanted stone and whispered portrait. Regulus, now 18, and bearing the lean aristocratic bearing that marked him as unmistakably adult, had settled into his role as one of Lord Voldemort's most trusted young Death Eaters, with a competence that impressed even the veteran members of their organization. The drawing room, where he had first received the Dark Mark, had become a regular gathering place for strategic meetings, its protective enchantments strengthened by layers of additional security charms that made it virtually impregnable to outside surveillance. Here, beneath portraits of black ancestors whose painted eyes gleamed with approval, the future of the wizarding world was planned and plotted with a methodical precision of master chess players moving pieces across a board of shadows. Regulus had proven himself particularly valuable in missions requiring subtlety and intelligence rather than brute force. His combination of pure blood connections, academic brilliance, and natural talent for concealment magic made him an ideal agent for the kind of delicate operations that required a light touch. Ministry officials who might have been suspicious of more notorious Death Eaters would welcome young Mr. Black into their offices and drawing rooms, never suspecting that their conversations were being carefully memorized and reported back to Lord Voldemort himself. It was during one such mission a carefully orchestrated dinner party at the home of a wavering ministry official that Regulus first heard whispers of something that would eventually shatter his world as completely as if the walls of Grimmauld Place had suddenly crumbled to dust. The conversation had turned, as such conversations often did among those who moved in the highest circles of magical society, to the question of Lord Voldemort's apparent invincibility. "No one seems able to stand against him for long," the host had murmured over brandy that glowed with inner warmth in their crystal snifters. "There are rumors, stories about magic that goes beyond anything we learnt at Hogwarts, ways of ensuring that death itself cannot touch those who have the knowledge and the will to transcend natural limitations." The words had lodged themselves in Regulus's memory like thorns, creating a persistent discomfort that he could not quite identify or dismiss. In the weeks that followed, he found himself paying closer attention to the conversations that swirled around Lord Voldemort's inner circle, listening with growing unease to references that seemed to hint at magical practices that ventured into territories that even the most ambitious pure-blood families had traditionally avoided. The first crack in his absolute faith came, oddly enough, through Kreacher. The ancient house elf had always been a constant presence in Regulus's life, a source of unconditional loyalty and devotion that had provided comfort and stability through every stage of his development. But as the Death Eater meetings at Grimmauld Place became more frequent and their discussions more intense, Regulus began to notice changes in his old friend's demeanor. Kreacher had always taken pride in serving the Black family, approaching even the most menial tasks with the dignity of someone who understood that his service was part of a grand tradition stretching back through centuries. But now there was something haunted in the elderly elf's lamp-like eyes, a shadow that seemed to deepen with each passing week. When Regulus attempted to engage him in their traditional conversations about family history and household management, Kreacher's responses were stilted and nervous, as if he were afraid of revealing something that should remain hidden. The truth emerged on a night in late November, when the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the window sills of Grimmauld Place with crystalline beauty. Regulus had returned from a particularly successful mission, the recruitment of 3 influential pure-blood families who had finally been persuaded to pledge their resources to Lord Voldemort's cause, and was seeking the comfort of Kreacher's familiar presence in the kitchen that had been the scene of so many childhood conversations. He found the house elf hunched over the great hearth, his gnarled hands trembling as they polished silver that already gleamed with mirror-like perfection. When Regulus spoke his name, Kreacher startled so violently that several pieces of the antique service clattered to the flagstone floor, their ringing echoing through the room like alarm bells. "Master Regulus," Kreacher gasped, his voice carrying notes of panic that Regulus had never heard before. Kreacher was not expecting Kreacher, was just tending to his duties. The conversation that followed would haunt Regulus for the remainder of his life. At first, Kreacher's responses were evasive, filled with the kind of careful non-answers that suggested he was operating under constraints that prevented him from speaking freely. But as Regulus pressed him with the gentle persistence that had always characterized their relationship, the truth began to emerge in fragments that pieced themselves together into a narrative of horror that defied comprehension. Lord Voldemort had commanded creatures' service for a mission that had taken them to a place of such malevolent power that the house elf's description of it seemed to leach warmth from the very air. A cave beside the sea, where darkness dwelt so thoroughly that even magical light seemed reluctant to penetrate its depths. Waters that moved with purpose and hunger, concealing creatures that had been twisted by dark magic into forms that represented the very antithesis of natural life. The Dark Lord required creatures' service, the elf whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the magical fire. Creature had to drink the potion in the basin, had to empty it so that the Dark Lord could place his precious object in the hiding place. The potion, it showed Creature terrible things, made him relive every moment of pain and fear from his long life. But Creature obeyed, as house elves must obey. As the story continued to unfold, Regulus felt something cold and terrible settling in the depths of his stomach. The precious object that Lord Voldemort had hidden with such elaborate precautions was described in terms that made it clear this was no ordinary magical artifact. It was something that pulsed with malevolent life of its own, something that seemed to whisper promises and threats in languages that predated human civilization. But it was Creature's description of Lord Voldemort's behavior during this mission that truly shattered Regulus's faith. The master he had served with such devotion, the great wizard whose vision of pure blood supremacy had given meaning and purpose to his life, had treated Creature with a casual cruelty that spoke of fundamental contempt for all forms of magical life except his own. When Creature had finished drinking the potion, the house elf continued, his ancient body shaking with the memory of trauma. When the precious object was safely hidden, the Dark Lord left Creature to die in the cave. The creatures in the water they came for Creature pulled him down into the cold depths. Only house elf magic saved Creature, allowed him to apparate home to serve the noble House of Black. But the Dark Lord, he never intended for Creature to survive. The implications crashed over Regulus like a wave of icy revelation. If Lord Voldemort was willing to sacrifice a house elf who had served him faithfully, what did that say about his ultimate regard for any of his followers? More troubling still was the question of what kind of magical object required such elaborate protection. What sort of precious artifact would be worth the kind of suffering that Creature had endured? In the days that followed, Regulus found himself haunted by memories of his conversations with Professor Slughorn about the theoretical limits of magical achievement. The old professor's references to Tom Riddle's interesting questions about the boundaries of magical possibility took on new and sinister significance. Late at night, when the rest of Grimmauld Place slumbered beneath its protective enchantments, Regulus made his way to the family library and began a research project that would consume his thoughts and reshape his understanding of everything he had believed about Lord Voldemort's cause. The Black Family Library contained one of the most comprehensive collections of dark arts texts in Britain, accumulated over centuries by family members who had understood that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, represented power. Books that were chained to their shelves to prevent their removal contained references to magical practices that pushed the boundaries between acceptable ambition and absolute evil. It was among these forbidden volumes that Regulus eventually found the answer to the mystery that had been tormenting him: Horcruxes. The word itself seemed to carry a weight that made the very air around it thick and oppressive. The text described them in terms that made clear why even the most ambitious dark wizards had historically avoided such practices. To create a Horcrux required not merely advanced magical knowledge, but a willingness to commit acts so fundamentally evil that they tore the soul itself, splitting it into fragments that could be hidden away from death, but never again made whole. The realization that Lord Voldemort had not merely studied such practices, but actually implemented them, struck Regulus with the force of a physical blow. Everything he had believed about his master's nobility, his vision of restoring proper order to the wizarding world, crumbled beneath the weight of understanding what true evil looked like when stripped of its rhetorical disguises. But knowledge alone was not enough to shatter the bonds of loyalty that had been forged through years of careful cultivation. It was the gradual accumulation of additional revelations, each one building upon the last like stones in an edifice of horror, that finally completed Regulus's transformation from devoted follower to determined opponent. The missions that had once filled him with pride began to reveal their true nature when viewed through the lens of his new understanding. The recruitment of wavering pure-blood families took on darker implications when he realized that Lord Voldemort's ultimate goal was not the elevation of magical bloodlines, but the subjugation of all magical life to his own twisted will. The casual cruelty toward house elves and other magical creatures was not an unfortunate side effect of necessary pragmatism, but a fundamental expression of his master's true character. Most damning of all was the growing realization that Lord Voldemort's promises of immortality and unlimited power came with costs that no rational person could accept. The creation of multiple Horcruxes did not merely split the soul. It transformed the creator into something that was no longer truly human, a creature that existed in a state of perpetual spiritual torment that could never be resolved or healed. The winter months passed in a blur of careful research and growing horror as Regulus gradually pieced together the full scope of Lord Voldemort's plan. The precious object that creature had helped to hide in the sea cave was not unique. It was one of several Horcruxes that his master had created to anchor his fractured soul to the mortal realm. Each one represented not just an insurance policy against death, but evidence of murders so heinous that they had literally torn apart the perpetrator's humanity. The knowledge that he had pledged his life and honor to serving a creature that had voluntarily transformed itself into something worse than the darkest magical creatures of legend filled Regulus with a shame that seemed to burn in his very bones. Every oath he had sworn, every mission he had completed, every moment of pride he had felt in bearing the dark mark became a source of agony that threatened to drive him to the edge of madness. But alongside the shame came something else, a cold, hard determination that gradually crystallized into purpose as clear and sharp as winter starlight. If Lord Voldemort's power depended upon the continued existence of his Horcruxes, then the destruction of those abominations became not merely a moral imperative, but a practical necessity. Someone had to find them, someone had to destroy them, someone had to ensure that the creature masquerading as a great wizard could finally be forced to face the death that he had cheated through such monstrous means. The plan that began to form in Regulus's mind during those long winter nights was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. Creature's survival of the cave ordeal had provided invaluable intelligence about the location and protection of at least one Horcrux. House elf magic operated according to different principles than wizard magic, making it theoretically possible for Creature to return to the cave and retrieve the locket that Lord Voldemort had hidden there. But the cost of such a mission would be enormous. The potion that protected the Horcrux had nearly killed Creature during his first encounter with it, and there was no guarantee that even house elf magic would be sufficient to overcome whatever additional protections might have been added since Lord Voldemort's initial visit. More troubling still was the certainty that such a mission, if discovered, would result in consequences that would make death seem like a mercy. Yet as spring returned to London and the gardens of Grimmauld Place began to bloom with their ancient magic-enhanced flowers, Regulus found that his resolve had hardened into something unshakable. The boy who had once sought to serve darkness had discovered within himself a capacity for moral courage that surpassed anything he had learned during his years of Death Eater training. The decision to act was precipitated by a conversation that took place during one of Lord Voldemort's visits to Grimmauld Place. The Dark Lord had been discussing his plans for the complete restructuring of wizarding society, painting a vision of the future that made clear his intention to reduce all magical life to the status of slaves serving his immortal will. As he spoke, his red eyes gleaming with the cold fire of absolute ambition, Regulus realized that passive resistance would never be sufficient to stop such evil. The time of half measures is ending, Lord Voldemort had said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the ancient house. Soon every magical creature in Britain will understand that there is no power in this world except the power that I choose to grant them. Those who serve me faithfully will be rewarded with positions of authority over lesser beings. Those who oppose me will discover that death is not the worst fate that can befall those who defy my will. That night, as Lord Voldemort and his followers departed into the London darkness, Regulus made his final decision. The locket Horcrux would be retrieved from its hiding place and destroyed, regardless of the personal cost. If he died in the attempt, at least his death would serve a purpose that transcended the selfish ambitions that had guided his earlier life. The conversation with Creature that sealed their mutual fate took place in the kitchen, where so many of Regulus's childhood memories had been formed. The house elf listened to his young master's plan with growing alarm, his lamp-like eyes reflecting both terror and something that might have been relief that someone finally understood the true nature of what they faced. Master Regulus must not ask this of Creature, the elf pleaded, his ancient voice breaking with emotion. The cave, the potion, the creatures in the water. Creature barely survived the first time. Master Regulus is too precious to risk in such a place of evil. But Regulus's determination was absolute, tempered by months of careful planning and the kind of cold courage that comes only to those who have accepted the necessity of sacrifice. Creature, he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of Black family tradition. We are the only ones who know where the Horcrux is hidden. We are the only ones who have the knowledge and the ability to destroy it. If we do nothing, if we allow our fear to paralyze us, then everything we love will be consumed by the darkness that Lord Voldemort represents. In the deepest hour of the night, when courage must be drawn from wells that run deeper than fear, and when the truest light shines forth from the darkest places, we come now to the moment that would define not merely the end of a life, but the beginning of a legacy that would echo through the corridors of time. Rest gently, dear listener, as we accompany young Regulus Black on his final journey into depths where heroes are born not from glory, but from the quiet determination to do what is right, regardless of the cost. The dawn of what would prove to be Regulus's last day at Grimmauld Place broke grey and soft over London's ancient stones, filtering through the tall windows of his childhood home like whispered promises of redemption. The house itself seemed to sense the significance of the approaching hours. Portraits stirred restlessly in their frames. Magical implements hummed with nervous energy, and even the very walls appeared to exhale with the weight of centuries holding their breath. Regulus stood before the mirror in his bedroom, the same mirror that had reflected his image on the morning of his first departure for Hogwarts, now showing him a young man whose eyes held depths that spoke of terrible knowledge and unwavering resolve. The dark mark on his left forearm, once worn with such pride, now felt like a brand of shame that burned with cold fire against his skin. Yet today, this symbol of his greatest mistake would serve its final purpose, providing him with the authority and access needed to complete his mission of redemption. In the kitchen below, Creature moved through his preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this might be the last service he would ever perform for a member of the family he had loved for so many decades. Ancient hands, gnarled with years of devoted labor, packed provisions with care that bordered on reverence. Magical protections were woven into every item, charms against cold and hunger, enchantments to preserve strength and clarity of mind, spells that might offer some small protection against the horrors they would soon face. The conversation they shared over breakfast was marked by the kind of gentle formality that comes to those who stand on the threshold between life and death. Each word carried weight that seemed to echo in the sacred spaces of memory. Each gesture became a kind of blessing offered and received between old friends who had shared a lifetime of loyalty and love. Creature wishes there was another way, the house elf murmured, his lamp-like eyes reflecting decades of devotion and growing sorrow. Master Regulus is too precious to lose to such darkness. The noble House of Black has already lost so much. Regulus reached across the ancient wooden table and placed his hand gently over Creature's withered fingers, a gesture that would have shocked his former Death Eater companions with his casual dismissal of pure blood superiority. There is no other way, old friend. We are the only ones who know the truth, the only ones who can act upon it. If we fail, if we allow fear to prevent us from trying, then the darkness wins by default. The journey to the coastal cliffs where Lord Voldemort had hidden his Horcrux began in the early afternoon, when the sun hung like a pale coin in the grey English sky. Regulus had chosen to apparate in stages, taking time between each jump to center himself and prepare for what was to come. Each destination brought them closer to the sea, closer to the ancient powers that dwelt in the deep places of the earth, closer to the confrontation that would test every aspect of his character and courage. The final apparition brought them to a windswept promontory overlooking the North Sea, where grey waters stretched toward horizons that seemed to blur the boundaries between sea and sky. Here, where the elemental forces of water and stone had carved their eternal dance into the very landscape, stood the entrance to a cave that had existed long before wizards had first learned to shape magic to their will. The opening in the cliff face was unremarkable to casual observation, merely a crack in the weathered stone that might have been dismissed as natural erosion by any muggle who happened to pass this way. But to magical senses, it pulsed with the kind of dark energy that made even experienced wizards step carefully and speak in whispers. This was a place where the barriers between the mortal world and darker realms had grown thin, where ancient powers had been awakened and bound to serve purposes that violated the natural order of things. Kreacher approached the cave entrance with visible reluctance, his ancient body trembling with a memory of trauma that had never fully healed. "Master Regulus," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the constant murmur of waves against stone. Kreacher remembers this place in his nightmares. The darkness here, it is not natural darkness. It is darkness that lives, that hungers, that remembers every evil thing that has been done within its embrace. Regulus drew his wand and cast a series of detection charms that revealed the true nature of the magical protections surrounding Lord Voldemort's hiding place. Layer upon layer of dark enchantments had been woven into the very stone, creating barriers that would have challenged even the most skilled curse breakers. Yet these protections had been designed with wizard magic in mind, and house elf magic operated according to different principles that might provide the key to overcoming them. The passage into the cave's depths felt like descending into the gullet of some primordial beast, a journey through spaces that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and causation. Their magical lights, sustained by spells that should have burned bright for hours, flickered and dimmed as if the darkness itself were feeding upon their illumination. The walls pressed close around them, slick with moisture that carried the metallic taste of old blood and older fears. As they descended deeper into the earth, the temperature dropped until their breath misted in the stagnant air, and strange echoes began to follow their footsteps. Not the natural reverberation of sound in enclosed spaces, but something that suggested they were not alone in these depths. Kreacher pressed close to his young master's side, drawing what comfort he could from the warmth of a human presence in a place that seemed to exist in eternal opposition to all forms of life and light. The cavern they eventually reached defied all expectation and logic, vast beyond the ability of torch or wand to illuminate fully. It stretched away into distances that seemed to bend back upon themselves in impossible ways. At its center lay a lake of black water that reflected no light, its surface so still it might have been polished obsidian rather than liquid. Upon this lake sat a single island, barely large enough to hold the stone basin that had been carved from some mineral that gleamed with sickly phosphorescence in the magical darkness. "The basin," Kreacher whispered, pointing with a trembling finger toward the island that held Lord Voldemort's prize. Kreacher had to drink every drop of the potion within it, had to empty it completely before the precious object could be retrieved. The potion. It shows you things, Master Regulus. Things that make you wish you had never been born, things that make death seem like a welcome friend. Regulus studied the scene before him with the analytical mind that had served him so well during his years at Hogwarts. The protections here were even more elaborate than those at the cave entrance, woven not merely to prevent theft, but to ensure that anyone attempting to claim the Horcrux would suffer agonies beyond imagination. The potion in the basin was clearly the key. It had to be consumed completely before the locket could be accessed, and the person drinking it would be subjected to torments designed to break even the strongest will. But there was something else as well, something that made his magical senses recoil with instinctive horror. The waters of the lake were not empty. Shapes moved in their depths, pale and luminous, waiting with the patience of predators who had learned that their prey would eventually come to them. Inferi, corpses animated by dark magic and bound to serve as guardians for their master's treasure. They would remain quiescent as long as the established pattern was followed, but any deviation from Lord Voldemort's prescribed ritual would bring them surging up from the depths in numbers that could overwhelm any single wizard. The boat that would carry them to the island appeared when Regulus stepped to the water's edge and spoke the command phrase that Creature had reluctantly provided. It emerged from the black depths like a fever dream made manifest. Ancient wood that gleamed with its own inner light, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, propelled by magic that drew its power from the same dark sources that animated the creatures swimming below. The journey across the lake passed in absolute silence, broken only by the gentle splash of oars that moved without any hand to guide them. Beneath the boat's hull, shapes glided through the water with sinuous grace, drawn by the living warmth above, but constrained by the magical compulsions that governed their existence. Regulus could feel their hunger, their eternal rage at being bound to this place of eternal darkness, their desperate desire to drag the living down into their cold embrace. Upon reaching the island, the true horror of Lord Voldemort's protections became fully apparent. The basin had been carved from a single piece of stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its surface covered with inscriptions in languages that predated human civilization. The potion within glowed with its own nauseating luminescence, thick and viscous like liquid shadow given form and purpose. Creature must drink it again, the house elf said, his voice hollow with the weight of terrible memory. House elf magic allowed Creature to survive the first time, though barely. Master Regulus is too precious to risk, too important to lose to such evil. But Regulus had already made his decision, crystallized during the long months of planning and preparation that had brought them to this moment. No, Creature. This is my burden to bear, my choice to make. You will watch, and when I have drunk enough to reveal the locket, you will take it and apparate home immediately. Do not wait for me. Do not try to save me. The locket must be destroyed, and you are the only one who knows how to accomplish that task. The first sip of the potion hit Regulus's system, like liquid fire poured directly into his soul. Images exploded behind his closed eyelids, memories that had been locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind, fears that had been buried beneath years of careful control. regrets that rose up like accusations from the grave. He saw his brother Sirius, forever lost to him, through choices that could never be undone. He saw his parents, their faces twisted with disappointment and rage at their younger son's betrayal. He saw Lord Voldemort's red eyes burning with the promise of eternal torment for those who dared to defy his will. But with each agonizing swallow, Regulus forced himself to remember why he was here. What greater purpose justified this suffering? The images of personal pain began to mix with visions of the future that would unfold if Lord Voldemort's power remained unchecked. A world where darkness reigned absolute, where every living thing became nothing more than a tool to serve the will of a creature that had voluntarily abandoned its own humanity. The potion worked its way through his system like acid through his veins, each drop seeming to tear away another layer of his identity, until he felt himself dissolving into constituent elements of fear and anguish. His hands shook so violently that keeping the basin steady became an act of supreme will, and more than once he nearly lost consciousness entirely, saved only by Creature's voice calling his name like an anchor in the storm of hallucinations. Halfway through the basin's contents, the visions shifted from personal torment to something far worse. Glimpses of Lord Voldemort's true plans revealed through the psychic connection that bound all Death Eaters to their master. He saw the systematic extermination of every magical creature that refused to serve, the reduction of half-blood and muggle-born wizards to the status of slaves, the transformation of the entire wizarding world into a pyramid of suffering with Lord Voldemort's immortal consciousness at its apex. These visions gave him the strength to continue drinking, even as his body rebelled against the potion's toxic effects. Each swallow became an act of defiance, a declaration that some lines could not be crossed without consequence. The boy who had once worn the dark mark with pride was dying in this cursed place, but from his sacrifice would come the knowledge needed to eventually destroy the monster he had once served. The basin was nearly empty when the inferi began to stir. The potion's level had dropped far enough to reveal the locket that lay at the bottom, glowing with malevolent inner light that spoke of the soul fragment trapped within its golden confines. But the disturbance to the lake's magical equilibrium had awakened the guardians below, and pale forms began breaking the surface with increasing frequency, drawn by the scent of living blood and the promise of warm flesh to drag down into their eternal cold. "Master Regulus," Creature cried, his voice carrying notes of panic that penetrated even the fog of hallucinations surrounding his young master's consciousness. "The creatures are rising. Creature must get the locket now, before they overwhelm us." With the last of his strength, Regulus tilted the basin and drained the final drops of potion, his body convulsing as the concentrated evil completed its work upon his nervous system. The locket lay revealed at last, its serpentine design writhing with movement that had nothing to do with reflected light. This was it, one of the anchors that tethered Lord Voldemort's fractured soul to the mortal realm, the key to understanding how the Dark Lord's power might eventually be broken. Creature's ancient hands closed around the locket with reverent care, and immediately the house elf began the complex magical preparations that would allow him to apparate from this cursed place. But the inferi had fully awakened now, rising from the lake in numbers that seemed to defy the waters to contain them. Pale, luminous forms clambered onto the island with movements that retained just enough humanity to make their undead state all the more horrifying. "Go, creature!" Regulus gasped, forcing his poisoned body to rise from beside the empty basin. "Take the locket and go now. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Everything depends on you completing this mission." The house elf's eyes filled with tears that glowed like liquid diamonds in the hellish light of the cavern. "Creature will not abandon Master Regulus. Creature will find a way to save Creature," Regulus interrupted, his voice carrying the full authority of the Black family name despite his weakness. "I order you to leave this place immediately. Take the locket to Grimmauld Place and destroy it by whatever means necessary. That is my final command as your master, and you will obey it." The compulsion of direct orders given by a family member was too strong for any house elf to resist, no matter how much love and loyalty might argue against obedience. With a crack like breaking thunder, Creature vanished from the island, taking with him the locket that contained such a crucial part of Lord Voldemort's power. Regulus faced the approaching inferi with the calm that comes to those who have accepted the inevitability of death and found peace in the knowledge that their sacrifice serves a greater purpose. His wand felt strange in his hand, not the familiar tool of magic it had always been, but somehow lighter, as if the poison coursing through his system had begun to dissolve the connections that bound his soul to the physical world. The defensive spells he cast were weaker than they should have been, his magical energy sapped by the potion's toxic effects. But they were sufficient to hold back the first wave of attackers, buying precious seconds to ensure that Creature's escape would not be followed or traced. Fire bloomed in the cavern's darkness, driving back creatures that had grown accustomed to eternal cold, and for a brief moment, the island became a beacon of light in the heart of the abyss. But the inferi were too numerous, their hunger too ancient and implacable to be denied for long. They came from all sides, dragging themselves from the black water with movements that spoke of patience refined by centuries of waiting. Cold hands reached for him with grasping fingers, and dead eyes reflected the flames of his final spells with the empty light of phosphorescence on decaying wood. As they overwhelmed his defenses and pulled him down toward the lake's icy embrace, Regulus felt a strange sense of completion. The boy who had been sorted into Slytherin with such ceremony, who had taken the dark mark with such pride, who had believed so fervently in the superiority of pure blood and ancient magic, was dying as he had never expected to live, as a hero whose greatest victory would remain forever secret, whose sacrifice would echo through time in ways he could never imagine. The water closed over his head like a benediction, cold and final, but somehow cleaner than the poisoned air of the cavern above. In those last moments, as consciousness began to fade and the inferi dragged him down into depths that no living person had ever plumbed, Regulus Black smiled. He had betrayed everything he once believed in, had turned against the master he had sworn to serve, had chosen death over dishonor and sacrifice over survival. But in that betrayal, in that choice, he had found something that all his years of pure blood pride and magical education had failed to provide: the knowledge that some things were worth dying for, that love could triumph over fear, that even the darkest soul could find redemption if it was willing to pay the price. The locket was safe, carried beyond Lord Voldemort's reach by loyal hands that would not rest until their master's final command had been fulfilled. The first crack had been struck in the Dark Lord's armor of immortality, a flaw that would eventually grow to encompass his complete destruction. The boy who had sought to serve darkness had become the first light to shine in the deepest shadows, the first note in a song of rebellion that would eventually bring down the most feared wizard of his generation. In the ancient halls of Grimmauld Place, Creature wept over the locket he had sworn to destroy, his tears falling like rain upon the golden surface that contained such evil. But even in his grief, the house elf understood that his young master's sacrifice had not been in vain. The war against Lord Voldemort would continue, fought by others who might never know how a boy named Regulus Black had struck the first blow in their ultimate victory. In the gentle hours that follow great storms, when the world settles into new patterns shaped by forces that have passed beyond mortal sight, we come at last to the quiet epilogue of courage. Dear listener, as your breathing deepens and your consciousness drifts toward the peaceful shores of sleep, let us witness how heroism echoes through time like ripples on still water, how sacrifice plants seeds that bloom in seasons yet to come, and how the boy who died in darkness became a star that would guide others toward the light. The morning after Regulus Black's sacrifice dawned grey and subdued over Grimmauld Place, as if the ancient house itself mourned the loss of its youngest heir. In the kitchen, where so many conversations had shaped a young wizard's understanding of the world, Creature sat hunched over the golden locket that had cost his beloved master's life, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks like rain upon autumn leaves. The house elf's grief was a thing of terrible beauty, unmarred by the complications that so often attend human sorrow. It was pure, elemental, as honest as the sunrise, and as enduring as the stones upon which Grimmauld Place had been built. For hours he remained motionless, the locket clutched in his gnarled hands, his ancient heart breaking with each breath that reminded him his young master would never again walk these corridors or seek comfort in their familiar conversations. But beneath the grief lay something else, a determination forged in the depths of loyalty and tempered by the weight of final commands that could never be disobeyed. Master Regulus had given him a task, a sacred trust that transcended even the bonds of life and death. The locket must be destroyed, regardless of the cost, regardless of the difficulty, regardless of how many attempts it might require. The first efforts to destroy the Horcrux revealed the true extent of Lord Voldemort's magical protections. Creature tried every method at his disposal. House elf magic older than wizarding civilization, enchanted fires that could melt the hardest metals, curses learned from centuries of serving the Black family's darkest interests. The locket absorbed each assault with malevolent indifference, its golden surface unmarred, its evil contents untouched by any force that Creature could bring to bear. Days passed in frustration and growing despair. The locket seemed to pulse with awareness of its guardian's efforts, occasionally emitting whispers in voices that Creature recognized. Master Regulus calling for help from beyond the veil. The ancient Black ancestors expressing disappointment in their descendants' failure. Lord Voldemort himself promising rewards for faithful service if only the locket were returned to its rightful place. But Creature had learned to recognize lies, had seen too much of evil's true face to be deceived by honeyed words and false promises, he pressed on with his attempts at destruction, driven by love that burned purer than any magical fire, by loyalty that ran deeper than the foundations of the world itself. Meanwhile, the wizarding world beyond Grimmauld Place's protective walls continued its slow descent into chaos and terror. Lord Voldemort's power grew with each passing month, his Death Eaters striking at targets both symbolic and strategic, his influence spreading through the Ministry of Magic like poison through clean water. The absence of one young wizard from their ranks went entirely unnoticed. Regulus Black had been a valued servant, but hardly irreplaceable, and his failure to report for assigned missions was attributed to illness or family obligations that would surely be resolved in due course. At the Dark Lord's gatherings, when attendance was called and names were spoken in tones of reverence and fear, Regulus's absence became a topic of minor curiosity rather than concern. Evan Rosier, promoted to fill some of the responsibilities that had once been his friends, occasionally wondered about Regulus's extended silence, but found his own duties too demanding to pursue the matter further. Young Black has always been devoted to his family. Barty Crouch, Jr. observed during one such gathering, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness that marked those who had never learned to value true friendship. Perhaps his mother has claimed his time for some domestic matter. He'll return when his sense of duty compels him. The irony of that statement, that Regulus's truest sense of duty had indeed compelled him, but toward betrayal rather than loyalty, would never be appreciated by those who spoke it. The Death Eaters continued their work of terror and subjugation, unaware that one of their number had struck the first blow against their master's immortality, unaware that their seemingly impregnable leader carried within himself a fatal flaw that would eventually encompass his complete destruction. Months turned to seasons, and still the locket resisted every attempt at destruction. Creature grew thinner, more desperate, his grief gradually transforming into something approaching madness as the weight of his failure pressed down upon his ancient shoulders. The house itself seemed to echo his despair. Portraits hung askew in their frames. Magical implements lost their luster, and the very walls appeared to weep with moisture that tasted of salt and sorrow. It was during the depths of winter, when snow piled high against the windows and the magical fires burned low in their hearts, that salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. Harry Potter, the boy whose very existence had become synonymous with resistance to Lord Voldemort's power, stood in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place and listened with growing amazement as Creature related the tale of Master Regulus's final mission. The story emerged in fragments, punctuated by sobs and interrupted by the house elf's need to pause and gather strength for the most painful memories. But gradually, the full scope of Regulus's transformation and sacrifice became clear to the young wizard who had inherited so many of the burdens that the war against darkness demanded. Harry's understanding of the locket's nature, his knowledge of Horcruxes gained through months of research, and Professor Dumbledore's careful tutelage provided the key that Creature had been seeking for so long. The ancient house elf watched with wonder and growing hope as Harry explained the true nature of the object he had been trying to destroy, the reason for its resistance to conventional magical assault, the specific methods that might prove effective against such abominations. Master Regulus knew, Creature whispered, his voice filled with awe at his young master's prescience. Somehow, he understood what this evil thing was, understood why it had to be destroyed. He gave his life so that others might have the knowledge needed to complete what he began. The destruction of the locket, when it finally came, was both climactic and strangely anticlimactic. The sword of Gryffindor, impregnated with basilisk venom from Harry's second-year adventure in the Chamber of Secrets, pierced the golden surface with a sound like the world's fabric tearing. The scream that emerged from the destroyed Horcrux carried notes of rage and agony that seemed to echo from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. And for a moment the very air in the kitchen shimmered with released malevolence, seeking a target for its fury. But then it was over. The locket lay in pieces, its evil essence dissipated like smoke in a cleansing wind. Creature stood trembling beside the remains, his aged body shaking with the relief of a burden finally lifted, a sacred trust at last fulfilled. "It is done," he whispered, and in those simple words lay the weight of years spent in faithful service, months of desperate attempts, and the love of a master whose sacrifice had made victory possible. Master Regulus can rest now. His mission is complete. The news of Harry Potter's success in destroying another of Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes spread through the underground resistance network like wildfire, carrying with it the first real hope that the Dark Lord's seemingly invincible power might indeed have limits. But with that news came another story, quieter but no less significant. The tale of a young Death Eater who had turned against his master and paid the ultimate price for his change of heart. Among those who heard Creature's account of Regulus's final mission, the reaction was one of stunned amazement. Here was proof that even those who had fallen deepest into darkness retained the capacity for redemption, that love could indeed triumph over hatred, that sacrifice could transform even the most tainted soul into something approaching sainthood. Hermione Granger, whose analytical mind had always sought to understand the deeper patterns underlying the war's chaos, spent long hours researching the Black family history and piecing together the full scope of Regulus's transformation. He was so young, she said to Harry one evening as they sat in the library at Grimmauld Place, surrounded by the books that had once educated a boy whose destiny none could have foreseen. Barely 18 when he died, and he had already learned truths that some never discover in entire lifetimes. The portrait of Sirius Black's mother, which had terrorized residents of Grimmauld Place with her bigoted ravings for so many years, fell silent when she learned of her younger son's fate. For days she remained motionless in her frame, her painted eyes fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of artistic representation. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried notes of something that might have been pride. "My Regulus," she whispered, and for the first time in decades, her words carried love rather than hatred. "My brave, foolish, noble boy." He understood what it meant to be a Black. Not the shallow prejudices I taught him, but the deeper truth that honor requires sacrifice, that nobility demands courage, that sometimes love compels us to betray everything we thought we believed. As the war continued its bloody course toward resolution, Regulus's story began to take on the quality of legend among those who fought against darkness. His name was whispered in safe houses and spoken with reverence in the hidden gatherings where resistance plans were forged. He became a symbol of hope for those who believed that redemption was possible, even for the most lost souls, that courage could bloom in the most unlikely hearts. The final defeat of Lord Voldemort, when it came at last in the ruins of Hogwarts Castle, carried with it the echoes of every sacrifice that had made victory possible. Among the names spoken with reverence in the aftermath of that climactic battle, Regulus Black held a place of honor, despite the fact that most who heard his story had never known him in life. In the years that followed the war's end, as the wizarding world slowly healed from the wounds that darkness had inflicted, Regulus's legacy began to take more concrete form. A memorial plaque was installed in the depths of Hogwarts Castle, in a corridor that connected the Slytherin common room to the rest of the school, a placement that spoke to his unique position as a bridge between the house of his birth and the cause he ultimately chose to serve. The inscription, composed by Hermione Granger and approved by a committee that included survivors from every house, read simply, Regulus Black, who discovered that the greatest courage lies not in never falling, but in choosing to rise again, who proved that love is stronger than fear, that light can bloom in the deepest darkness, and that heroism often wears the face of quiet sacrifice. Creature, granted his freedom by Harry Potter, but choosing to remain at Grimmauld Place as its guardian and chronicler, became the keeper of Regulus's memory and the teller of his story. Visitors to the ancient house would often find the elderly house elf in the library, carefully maintaining the books and papers that had once belonged to his beloved master, ready to share the tale of sacrifice and redemption that had transformed a Death Eater into a hero. The house itself seemed to bloom with new life in the aftermath of Regulus's vindication. Portraits that had remained silent for years began to speak again, their voices carrying notes of pride and wonder at the transformation their youngest family member had undergone. The magical atmosphere that had once been heavy with secrets and shadows lightened, as if the truth of Regulus's sacrifice had lifted burdens that had weighed upon the ancient stones for far too long. Professor McGonagall, in her capacity as headmistress of Hogwarts, instituted an annual lecture series in Regulus's honor, focusing on the themes of moral courage and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. These lectures, delivered by wizards and witches who had survived the war and learned its deepest lessons, became among the most popular and well-attended events in the school's calendar. Young Black represents something that we must never forget, Professor McGonagall would say in her opening remarks each year, that the capacity for good exists within every soul, no matter how deeply it may be buried, that the choices we make define us more than the circumstances of our birth, that heroism is not the absence of fear or error, but the willingness to acknowledge our mistakes and pay whatever price is necessary to set them right. The students who heard these lectures, young witches and wizards from all four houses, representing every blood status and background, would often seek out the memorial plaque afterward, standing in respectful silence before the simple tribute to a boy whose courage had helped save their world. Many would leave small tokens of respect flowers, picked from the castle grounds, notes of gratitude written in childish handwriting, small magical lights that would burn for days before finally fading. In the Department of Mysteries, where the deepest secrets of magical existence were studied and catalogued, researchers began to investigate the phenomenon that Regulus's transformation represented. How was it possible for someone so deeply committed to evil to achieve such complete moral reversal? What forces within the human soul made such dramatic change possible? Their studies would continue for decades, adding new chapters to the understanding of magical psychology and the nature of moral choice. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Regulus's memory came from an unexpected source. Lord Voldemort's defeat had left behind a power vacuum in the darker corners of magical society, a space that various would-be successors attempted to fill with their own brands of hatred and ambition. When such figures arose, when new movements began to coalesce around old prejudices and familiar hatreds, those who opposed them would often invoke Regulus's name as a reminder that redemption was always possible. Remember Regulus Black became a rallying cry for those who sought to reach the hearts of the misguided rather than simply defeating them through superior force. Remember that the boy who wore Voldemort's mark became the first to strike against him. Remember that love is stronger than hate, that courage can bloom in any heart, that it is never too late to choose a better path. The constellation of Regulus, that distant star from which the young wizard had taken his name, seemed to burn brighter in the years following his posthumous vindication. Astronomers, both magical and muggle, noted the phenomenon with scientific interest, while those who understood the deeper connections between celestial bodies and human destiny recognized it as a sign that heroism, once achieved, echoes through realms beyond mortal comprehension. In Grimmauld Place, in the kitchen where a boy had once listened to house elf stories and absorbed the values that would ultimately guide his greatest choice, a new portrait appeared on the wall. It showed Regulus not as the Death Eater he had become, but as the hero he had died being, young, determined, with eyes that held depths of courage and sacrifice that spoke to the best possibilities of the human spirit. The portrait was painted by a witch who had survived Voldemort's reign of terror and dedicated her post-war life to commemorating those whose sacrifices had made victory possible. She had never known Regulus in life had worked only from creatures' descriptions and the few photographs that remained in the family collection. But somehow she had captured something essential in those painted features. The transformation from follower to leader, from shadow to light, from fear to love. Visitors to the house would often pause before this portrait, drawn by something ineffable in the painted eyes that seemed to look directly into their souls and ask the eternal question that Regulus's life had ultimately answered. When the time comes to choose between comfort and courage, between the easy path and the right path, what will you do? The portrait itself never spoke. Magical portraits required the subject's participation during creation, and Regulus had died years before his image was captured, but its silent presence carried a weight that words could never have matched. It served as a reminder that heroism takes many forms, that the greatest victories are often won by those who will never live to see their triumph, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on great fields of honor, but in the secret chambers of the human heart. As the years passed, and new generations of wizards learned the story of the war that had shaped their world, Regulus Black's name took its place among the pantheon of heroes whose sacrifices had preserved the light. He stood alongside those who had died in great battles, and those who had lived to see victory, united by the common bond of having chosen love over fear when the choice mattered most. Children would learn his story in their history classes. Young wizards would read about his transformation in books about moral courage, and parents would tell his tale to sons and daughters as an example of the possibility that always exists within every soul for redemption and renewal. His legacy lived not in monuments of stone or bronze, but in the hearts of those who understood that true nobility lies not in never falling, but in the willingness to rise again.